Ah, nice. I actually do get to sit on the stage for once. And this next keynote is one that I have been personally looking forward to all day. It's called Worldmaking and Abolition, or how to completely reimagine the music industry we have always wanted. For those of you not familiar with the terminology, abolition is the act of ending an activity or custom officially. Like, for example, institutions that rely on depriving people of liberty and on punishment instead of compensating and integrating them. Abolition can happen via dismantling, divesting, or defunding said institutions. Worldmaking refers to the way we disrupt and dream beyond the limitations of what currently exists, to imagine and remake what is possible, and rather than reforming broken and exclusionary systems, which are oftentimes based on oppressive structures such as racial capitalism or misogyny in the music industry, figures like Harry Belafonte, Underground Resistance, Janelle Monae, Anonhi, Frank Ocean, and Lorde, as well as some newly emerging tech innovators in music, have modeled for us abolitionist and radical ways of divesting from and reimagining the current business of music. And speaking to us about this will be Jason King, who's the chair of New York University's Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music and director of NYU's Berlin's Future Pop Music Studies program, which also happens to be just across the street, but today he's online. Hello, Jason.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Thanks for having me here.
So you can just start whenever.
Okay. I'm happy to just get started. Thank you so much. So I have a very short amount of time for this presentation, about 30 minutes, and I think there's 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm gonna get right into it. As was mentioned, I'm chair of the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at New York University, program director for music program at NYU Berlin. I've been writing about the relationship of popular music and politics for the past 20 years. I've been writing for Pitchfork. I did a piece on the 2010s, the decade in popular music and politics. In 2021, I wrote a piece about the changes in activism and organizing that we're seeing in popular music, also for Pitchfork. I teach a class on world making and ethics, and the subtitle of that class is called Transforming the Music Business Through Organizing Activism and Social Justice Leadership. And I'm co-teaching it this spring with Binta Brown, the co-founder of the Black Music Action Coalition. I'm also a talking head in a lot of documentaries, including Henry Louis Gates' new documentary series, Making Black America, which is a documentary series that turns a rare lens on the way Black Americans have built self-enclosed worlds of pleasure and joy and self-sustenance in the face of inhospitable and unrelenting racism. So things like Martha's Vineyard, the self-sustaining Black community in the American Northeast, queer clubs of the 1970s and 80s, like the Paradise Garage, all of those are world-making activities. I'm also a consultant on Let's Get Free, which is a new social justice and equity-based music festival created by the founder of Afropunk, Matthew Morgan, and his partner, Jocelyn Cooper. So I mention all of that because hopefully that gives you a sense of the background that I'm bringing to this conversation. I know we're here on Zoom and you're in the room. We're across continents, some language barriers, so please ask in the Q&A if you need me to explain anything or if there's anything you don't understand. I'm happy to do that. So first, let me just start with world making itself and a definition of it. So the term was founded in around 1978 by the scholar Nelson Goodman, who wrote the book Ways of World Making. And basically what it refers to is it's what happens when we face a crisis, when we face a broken system, structure, or institution that threatens to neglect us, diminish us, or eradicate us altogether. So it's what we do in the face of interlocking intractable problems that we face in the world, like racism and racial discrimination and gender discrimination, misogyny, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, climate destruction, right-wing fascism, anti-migration efforts, gentrification, homelessness, class stratification, poverty, famine, imperialism, neocolonialism, empire building. I could go on, and obviously I won't do that here. But world making refers to how we go beyond the limitations of the present and those problems in the present, how we dream how we imagine, conceptualize, and build new structures, new systems, new environments, new movements, new ideas, new institutions, new affiliations, new communities, new ways of being and feeling in the world. It's a dreaming and it's a reimagining of what's possible in the face of crisis by creating a kind of self-enclosed world where you and others like you can thrive. World making is necessary, it's urgent work, and it's often undertaken by those who are the most vulnerable, disenfranchised, relegated to the margins, people who are oppressed by those establishment institutions and structures and systems. And so they're creating their own. So world making has been at the heart of many radical social justice movements. Just to name a few, the Zapatistas in Mexico, for instance, who rejected the establishment government that wasn't serving them. They had a totally different vision of what society could be like and how it could be organized. So they created 5 autonomous self-governed regions in Chiapas, in the southeast of Mexico. They had their own healthcare system. They created their own legal system. They promoted young people and women in self-government. They created this entire world to sustain and support themselves. I could name other examples. The Black Panther Party in America in the 1960s, for instance, challenging police brutality in places like Oakland and other cities, organizing armed citizen patrols, instituting social programs, free breakfasts, health clinics, rehab programs, education advocacy, essentially doing for yourself and doing for your community when the establishment, when the government, when official systems won't serve you. I think ACT UP in the 1980s, created in America, when the AIDS epidemic was raging and it was a crisis, especially for gay communities. You had political administrations, the Reagan administration, presidential administration, Mayor Ed Koch in New York, where AIDS was at the epicenter, refusing to help or support those communities, right? And so LGBT community members formed an international political group to work to end the AIDS epidemic when the system would not do it. And did that through medical research, through treatment, through advocacy, through legislation, through public policies. So I think of ACT UP as a profound act of world making itself. All right, so thinking about this as it relates to the music industry, we have to also understand in which ways the music industry is a system that is broken for many, many people. So it really does start, I think, with awareness and enlightenment and a kind of diagnosis of the problems, especially the interlocking problems that the music industry currently faces. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I only have a limited amount of time. We could talk about the problems of the music industry for a very, very long time. But the music industry that I want to work in, and I hope the music industry that you want to work in, is one that absolutely supports innovation and developments in technology, but also allows artists and other creative music makers to be justly compensated and recognized for their work. We need a music industry that prioritizes all levels of artists and creators. But to get there, we need a music industry that's ethical, that is morally sound, that is equitable, that's inclusive, that's diverse in intersectional ways, gender diverse, racially diverse, diverse in terms of sexual orientation, physical ability, nationality, language, and so on. We need a music industry, a global music industry that has a healthy and supported middle class. And what we've seen, of course, over the last 20 years is the decimation of the middle class in the world, but also in the music industry, kind of shrinking of the middle class. And this kind of entrenched class division in music between the superstars, the few superstars who are making money, and then kind of everybody else who's struggling to figure out how to sustain a career. So how is it possible in the music industry? How can it continue to be possible to support and sustain yourself as a musician or creative person if you're not a superstar like BTS or Adele? We need a music industry that is non-oppressive, that's humane, that's non-toxic, non-exploitative, that is green, sustainable, that supports a low carbon footprint. The existing music industry that we have is clearly very profitable. In 2021, the global recorded music market grew by almost 19%, largely through paid subscription streaming. That was a key driver of overall growth in the music industry. So it's working on one level. But if you judge it by those values I was just mentioning above, I think you can only really describe it as a kind of intrinsically broken industry, and it's always been broken. There's this very kind of tongue-in-cheek article from Digital Music News that I'm showing you here. This was from 2014. I think it was reprinted in 2016. And it was listing the music industry's 99 problems as a kind of reference to Jay-Z's classic song. I'm not going to go through them all, but just to summarize some of the things it said, it talked about the ways in which artists experience serious problems monetizing their work. They said 99% of artists cannot make a living wage off their music. That was according to statistics at the time from TuneCore. So we're looking at massive economic instability, unemployment, and this is before the pandemic literally pulled the rug out from musicians, right? And made it impossible for musicians to earn money from their primary source of revenue for many musicians, which is live music. In this article, it talks about the ways in which streaming music companies are among the most duplicitous and damaging toward artists, and gives reasons for that. Sorry for anyone out there who's from working in a streaming company. But basically what it's doing is describing the ways in which musicians exist in a kind of precariat class. And the idea of the precariat, that's Guy Standing's idea for a social class that's formed by people who are suffering from precarity, or they don't have security, financial security, they don't have material, psychological security, and so they are in a precarious state. And of course, everyone was thrust into this precarious, not everyone, but many musicians were thrust into this precarious state during the pandemic. And many of you have probably heard that recent news of Santigold, the artist who put out that heartbreaking social media message that she was not able to support her tour this year, simply, for a number of reasons coming out of the pandemic. And that's the story for, I think, a lot of other artists as well. So profound wealth inequality in the music business is part of the reason that it is broken. And of course, this relates even to artists at the highest echelon of the music industry, like people like Taylor Swift, forced to re-record her albums. In the grand scheme of things, that's probably a lesser problem than the ones that I've just been mentioning. But it is a cautionary tale about the problem of value extraction in the music industry, about issues of leverage and issues of ownership, that musicians rarely own the means of their own labor. Many musicians do not even own their own masters, and often are in disadvantageous recording contracts and disadvantageous contracts with streaming companies as well. On top of all of that, I should say that the music industry is obviously not an equitable space per se, not as inclusive as it should be or diverse as it should be. And we have data to back this up, including the Annenberg study that was done in 2021. This was the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative run by Dr. Stacy Smith at USC, which examined 4,060 music executives at 6 different types of companies, and found that only 19.8% were from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. So essentially what that means is that in the upper most leadership positions of the music industry, chief executives, chairmen, presidents, etc., 86.1% of those leadership people in leadership in the United States, 86.1 are both white and male, right? So that is a gross imbalance that does not represent the diversity of American culture. And I think obviously if you look at Europe, those numbers will also be pretty negative. And by the way, in that study, they identified 10 people of color holding high positions at record labels and independents, but only 2 of those were women. So it's incredibly exclusionary, depending on your intersectional positionality, right? So if you're a woman of color, the glass ceiling is not just a mythology in music, it's an actual thing that you're going to hit your head against constantly in a major way. And Stacy Smith of the Annenberg Inclusion Report described the music industry as a diversity desert, right? So like famine. So that, to me, represents a huge issue, right? Gender pay inequality, anti-Blackness, systemic erasure of people of color from these top positions. This is sustained, it's structural, and this is over time. Of course, what this does to people as well, the toxicity, the impact on people's mental health. Sally Ann Gross and George Musgrave from the UK have this amazing book called Can Music Make You Sick? Measuring the Price of Musical Ambition, where they think about the relationship of music and the kind of toxic problems sustained within the music industry and how that impacts people's mental health. We even have the 27 Club. We romanticize in the music industry and beyond the idea that so many of our most famous and most innovative musicians die at the age of 27. So it's not just musicians, it's also executives as well, and other people who work in creative aspects of creative and administrative aspects of the music industry. I will just quickly go one step further than digital music news and say that part of the reason that the music industry is broken for so many people has to do with its roots in America, in a morally bankrupt system of racial capitalism. So the music industry, it should not come as a surprise to anybody unless we're divorced from our history, is historically rooted in racist white supremacist practices, which are still in many ways at the root of some of our music institutions globally, and even our very ways of being in music. So racial capitalism, what's called plantation capitalism, that's part of the history of slavery, plantations in the Americas, where the business owner, the person who owns a slave, would think of his workers as a commodity, as an object, an expense to be minimized. And what you do with those workers is you extract labor from them. It's a kind of stolen labor, right? Where you're not fully paying them what they're due, what they're worth. And so the whole story of the United States, and also the history of the Atlantic slave trade, which of course also impacts, not only impacts Europe, but is happening throughout Europe. It's a story of stolen labor. It's a story of value extraction. It's a story of racial capitalism that shows up in the music industry through the theft that is represented by minstrelsy, race records in the 1920s. That's what albums were called in the 1920s in the United States. They were extremely segregated. And then it continues throughout the history of popular music. But it even goes deeper than that. The recording contract itself in music is based on a model of plantation capitalism, which comes from slavery, in which your talent, your value is a commodity, but you don't own your masters. And because of recoupment and cross-collateralization and other kinds of clauses in the music industry, you're more often not sort of tied as an artist to the company that represents you, sometimes in perpetuity. And recording contracts in the United States, at the birth of the music industry, they came of age in the era of Jim Crow capitalism. And so they are a reflection of the exploitative and predatory artist-company relationships that come from that moment in time in the post-Civil War moment in the United States, and spread all over the world. So if you have any genuine interest in realizing an anti-racist music industry, you have to question the very historical roots of the music industry and whether its business models rooted in corporate conglomeration, co-optation, value extraction, plantation capitalism, and so on, to say nothing of its relationship to misogyny, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and so on. Is any of this really sustainable? Is any of it sustainable? It certainly can earn a profit, but how do we make it an inclusive, participatory industry in which more people can participate, given its problematic history and problematic roots? All right, so all that takes me to thinking about reform. Reform attempts in the music industry are typically what's offered as a solution to the problems that the music industry represents. So that means advocacy, that means working within the existing industry to change it from within. So you're trying to create equality in the system, but you're basically saying, let's leave the system intact. And by diversifying the system, hopefully the diverse members themselves will take on the burden of transforming the industry. And so I don't want to minimize the work that's being done in the reform area. I think it's very important and very valid. Organizations like She Is the Music, Key Change, The Show Must Be Paused, which is the organization that showed up in the aftermath of the global racial justice protests after the murder of George Floyd, which was aiming for more transparency in the music industry, the recruitment and professionalization of more executives of color in the music industry. There's also organizations like the Black Music Action Coalition. We saw labels like Warner Music Group announcing $100 million funds and so on. All of these attempts at reform of the existing industry, I think, are incredibly important. But there is a question of whether they have actually done the work that they said they were going to do. And that's not just a question for the music industry, but also for all of the industries in that post-summer 2020 moment that said they were going to do all of this work to transform the industry. And we have to really, in various industries, and we have to question whether some of that work has really happened in a way that has been actually transformative, or whether it's been more, kind of presentational or performative in some ways. So all of that said, getting to world making, beyond just reforming a broken system, world making differs from those reformist attempts and corporate diversity efforts to radically reimagine and revolutionize our current music industry and the platform economies that support it. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip past a couple of these quotes that I wanted to do, but I'll just give you a couple from the Marxist abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She says that, what the world will become already exists in fragments, pieces, experiments, and possibilities. And I take from this that if we want to reimagine industries like the music industry, what we have to do is identify the fact that pieces of the future industry, the industry that we want, ultimately are already here. And it's up to us to illuminate and cultivate those fragments and pieces and experiments and possibilities and turn them into sustainable ways of being and moving in the world. Let me skip past this one. And then Ocean Vuong, the great author, says something that matters to me as an educator, which is that we often tell our students the future's in your hands, but I think the future is actually in your mouth. You have to articulate the world that you want first. So again, an important lesson, I think, in the idea that you not only have to be committed and you have to believe that another world is possible, but you also have to be able to articulate it, and you need historical models to do that. Okay, so I'm going to skip past Ava DuVernay. If I had more time, I would really talk about her work, because I think of her as, and I think she thinks of herself as a world maker and somebody who is an institution builder, who is essentially not just looking for a seat at the table, but questioning why we are sitting at these tables at all, why we need tables, why do we need chairs, why do we need certain kinds of rooms, why can't we create our own rooms? She is world making. She's imagining possibility, to address existing crises in the film business through the work that she's doing, particularly with Array, which is her distribution company, which seeks to offer opportunities to women of color who've been erased or marginalized from the film industry. But let me get to abolition, because I think it's incredibly important here. So abolition, as was mentioned in the introduction, an 18th century and post-18th century movement in Europe and the Americas to end the Atlantic slave trade and to free the enslaved. Abolitionist practices were incredibly important to ending slavery. They were the moral backbone of the movement to end slavery, which as an institution, for hundreds of years, was unimaginably oppressive and dehumanizing. And for many, I'm sure, seemed like an intractable problem that could never be solved. But abolitionist practice was incredibly important to ending that. And now the term abolition is being increasingly used to refer to the carceral system in America, the idea of defunding prisons and police departments and redistributing resources away from broken institutions to community-sustaining practices and policies. So we have contemporary abolitionists like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who I just mentioned, Angela Davis, and so on, who are trying to reimagine the prison system in America and around the world as well. And they argue that abolitionist politics and practices are the most effective way to reimagine the limits of that system. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, in fact, asks, instead of asking whether anyone should be locked up in a prison or go free, why don't we solve problems by repeating? Why don't we think about why we solve problems by repeating the kind of behavior that brought us the problem in the first place? She says abolition means not just closing of prisons or defunding prisons, but instead asking about vital systems of support that many communities lack. Instead of asking how in a future without prisons we will deal with violent people, abolitionists ask, how do we resolve inequalities and get people the resources they need long before the hypothetical moment when they quote unquote mess up? Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey, the scholars, they even go further. And they say abolition is, we can't just have abolition, we need abolition democracy. So it's not just about abolishing prisons or abolishing slavery, but abolishing the elimination of a society, of a civilization that needs prisons, right? Like we have to go further than just abolishing the thing, but to actually completely reimagine the system altogether, the structure altogether. Okay, so in the context of the music industry, this means a lot of different things. For some people, this is about ending the label system altogether because of its history in value extraction and predatory capitalism. I'm not going to go too deep into this because I think the push to defund or disinvest from labels has largely subsided, not largely subsided, in some ways has subsided as a major conversation talking point. It was for a short amount of time, especially in the summer of 2020. Here's Joshua Virtue of Y Records talking about the idea of just abolishing labels and coming up with a different system by which to distribute music. There's been discussions of abolishing genres, right? Anything that limits people's freedom, creative freedom, and ability to actually exist in the world. What would that look like? So here's Tinashe, the singer, leading a conversation about that. Abolishing copyright itself, with the argument that existing copyright laws limit creativity, from George Harrison and his legal problems around the song My Sweet Lorde in the 1970s, all the way up to hip hop in its golden age to the current moment. Some would argue that copyright is increasingly outdated, out of pace with how creativity works, and we need to abolish it or at very least completely reform it to allow for what you call copyleft licenses that allow users to maintain ownership of their material, but in a way that is much more flexible. There's been attempts to abolish Silicon Valley itself. Wendy Liu's book here, Abolish Silicon Valley, I think is an important contribution there. It's not really about abolishing, it's actually more about reforming Silicon Valley. But she basically makes an argument that the state is supposed to be doing a lot of the things that apps supposedly do for people. So a lot of our public goods, space travel, smart cars, et cetera, they've been all privatized. And I think we see the limits of some of our contemporary tech companies and their ability to actually serve people in a way that's inclusive and participatory. I think we've seen this with the meltdown of Twitter this past week and a half, for instance. So Wendy Liu's book is incredibly important. And I would also argue Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, which looks at abolitionist tools for dismantling what she calls the new Jim Crow, which is how algorithms have racism baked into them. In so many ways. And so she argues that we need a completely new way of thinking about the value of tech in our lives, and we should do that through an abolitionist practice. Okay, quickly moving through some other stuff here. So another aspect of abolition that we need to think about is fugitivity, which goes hand in hand with abolitionist practice. And to be a fugitive means to flee from something. It's a term that used to be used, or still is used, to describe slaves who ran away from their oppression and their bondage in search of freedom. And they created these complex networks of escape. And so this term has more recently been picked up by academics to think about the practice of fleeing from any oppressive system, where you then go and live and are sort of branded as an outlaw who exists outside of official systems, those same systems that have denied you your full humanity. So fugitivity in the music industry could mean fleeing from any oppressive system that limits your freedom, whether it's a major label or a streaming service or the Grammys or whatever it may be, making your exit from an oppressive system. And by doing so, ideally destituting the system. So, it can no longer function if it doesn't have the support of the people on which it relies. Fred Moten refers to this act of fugitivity in terms of slavery and says that what we need to do is refuse the thing that has been refused to us. So typically your oppressor might say, hi, I understand there's a problem. Can I give you a piece of the very thing that I have been refusing to you all this time? Right. So I'd like you to become the CEO of our very broken company. They argue instead, what you can do as a practice is refuse the thing that has been refused to you and flee into the wilderness, which they call the undercommons. And then from there, you create your own structures, you build your own worlds, et cetera. As an example of this, just want to bring up the notion of Prince in the 1990s, who wrote the word slave on his face. Problematic gesture in many ways, but also a kind of radical demonstration of his desire to be emancipated from what he called his corporate overlord, which is Warner Music at the time. And he says, when you stop a man from dreaming, he becomes a slave. That's where I was. I don't own my own music. If you don't own your masters own you. This was also true of George Michael as well, who literally became a kind of fugitive, right? Fled from the music industry, didn't even want to use his image in videos like Freedom 1990, and he called himself a professional slave. The other example I would just give as I kind of wrap up and move to some other stuff here is Frank Ocean. And we don't often think of Frank Ocean in terms of any kind of revolutionary activity as far as the music business necessarily. But there's an interesting essay called "The Free Black Artist: Frank Ocean Through a Decolonial Lens." And in this article by Benjamin Llewellyn Taylor, he diagnoses the problem, which is the historical degradation of Black artists in the music industry, and he calls it a form of neocolonialism. So looking at white parent-owned companies and Black artists who don't own the terms of their labor within the context of those parent companies. And what he argues in this piece, which I think is an important and counterintuitive piece, is that Frank Ocean staged a quiet rebellion against the label system and against the Grammys, as well as the kind of system that in America that identifies value and merit in the industry. And he disrupted those structures. And in so doing, he also affirmed his own Black queer life as sacred in the context of an industry that very rarely supports Black queer identity. So first, it started with his letter in 2012, where he refused to label his sexuality, kind of refusing to play by the rules of the industry, which required men, especially Black men, to stay in the closet. What he came out of the closet and he wanted to be out on the outside, a kind of fugitive who could care for himself. So he was leading with his own values, and his values ultimately trumped the industry's lack of values because he helped change the industry and make it a more inclusive place, which you see by the outcome artists like Lil Nas X and Saucy Santana and so on, who have more space to do what they did, partly because of Frank Ocean's example. But Frank Ocean refused to play the game. He played the game on his own terms. He called his time signed to the Def Jam label a 7-year chess game, meaning that he was signed, or many artists are signed to 7 album deals, and they're obligated by those deals to release albums over a period of time. His label didn't even know that he was signed to the label. He felt disrespected. He felt neglected. And he says, "It started to weigh on me that I was responsible for the moves that had made me successful, but I was not reaping the lion's share of profits, and that was problematic for me." So what he did is he released his album Nostalgia Ultra for free in 2012. Then he charged Def Jam $1 million for the next album, Channel Orange. That fulfilled the terms of his contract, and he disappeared for 4 years. This is a period of time that Fred Moten would call fugitive planning. During that time, he used his own money to buy himself out of his contract, to reclaim his master recordings. He released in 2012 the album Endless, which is a 45-minute visual streaming album that shows Frank Ocean building a spiral staircase while 18 songs play. And essentially, what we know about that album now is that he was building a stairway to heaven. He was building a way outside to the outside to get out. Worldmaking often means creating the terms of your own escape. So there's an example of Endless, where he's literally showing us building a staircase. And it relates in theological terms to what Martin Luther King once said about faith and activism, that faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. So an answer to the question of how do I build a new world when I'm in a broken or damaged one, it requires stepping out on faith and feeling your way into the future. So Frank Ocean did this through Endless. And then he released Blonde as well. This was a kind of power move in which he resisted the terms of his own commodification and exploitation. And he refused to promote the album in traditional terms. He ultimately even boycotted the industry by withholding Endless and Blonde from Grammy consideration. He refused the kind of accreditation system that bestows value in the music industry, the Grammys. And he said, it took me a long time to learn how to own my freedom. I bought all my masters back last year. Blonde sold 1 million units without a label. I'm a young, Black, gifted, and independent artist. That's my tribute. I'm one of the best alive. And he, refused to show up to the Grammys, refused to participate in the industry. And still to this day, he does what he wants to do. And so he actually called his Grammy boycott his Colin Kaepernick moment. And I think that's interesting because I also think of Colin Kaepernick, who's the NFL player who protested police brutality by kneeling during the national anthem in the 2016 season to protest systemic racism. It's interesting to think of Frank Ocean and think of Colin Kaepernick in the same conversation. And we can think of others as well. So I've got a lot more, but I'm going to wrap up pretty soon. The only other thing I wanted to talk about was the importance of science fiction to world building. It's incredibly important because it's what's called science fictional thinking. It helps us dream beyond the limitations of the present. In my classes on world building, which are business classes, I teach Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. I encourage students to read science fiction, particularly science fiction like Octavia Butler's, as a way of imagining beyond the structural presence. And Octavia Butler, by the way, has shown up in incredible ways in politics. Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, was hugely inspired by reading Octavia Butler, in particular, Parable of the Sower, which is a book about world making. And I'll also just say Janelle Monae, the artist, created the album Dirty Computer, which I think is one of the best albums of the 2010s, and an album that is very much about inclusion and participation and rethinking American democracy. And she did this based on her love for Octavia Butler and Parable of the Sower and other books as well. And she's gone on record as talking about that. Many other figures we could mention, but last thing I'll just say is the ownership conversation is one that really needs to happen in music more, and it's part of a world making conversation, because as you're building new institutions, new movements, new ways of being in the world, we need to think about economic justice, not just representation. How can people of color, how can women, et cetera, people who've been marginalized in the industry own the terms of their own labor, just as we saw with Frank Ocean. And there's a long history of that in the music industry, from Black Swan Records, very important early Black record label in America, to the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians in the 1960s, to Olivia Records, the woman-owned recording company in the 1970s. There's a new documentary out about them. And then, of course, even labels like Parkwood Beyonce is an incredible model that should be studied. Jesse Walden's Variant is an important, intervention, I think, in the idea of ownership within the context of streaming economies. Why are they just owned by a conglomerate of, why are there just a few of them that we can name? Why can't artists themselves and creatives have their own streaming services that they can monetize and that they can own? So we need to be thinking more about that. And then finally, I'll just add that Let's Get Free, this festival that I talked to you about in the beginning, is an attempt to create a very new kind of music festival that's social justice themed and based, that is really about trying to redistribute resources and share power, and create a self-sustained community of people of color and people who've been marginalized by their sexual orientation and other aspects, to be able to own a festival, and for those people to be able to feel included in a festival in ways that have gone beyond existing festivals. So I'm going to just leave it there because I've gone a little bit over, and I would love to take questions and answer questions. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. First of all, I hope you could hear the applause. I was very, very happy to actually listen to you because as a queer Black femme, I'm actually very familiar with the glass ceiling, also happening to be the only Black woman or even Black person being on this stage physically today. So, of course, this is something that I'm very familiar with, and it was really, really nice to get the abolitionist lens on things. You mentioned something which I want to briefly go into. You mentioned that corporate diversity efforts are somewhat of a more reformatory strategy to actually approach injustice, correct? So,
Yes.
But we can both agree that in short term, those measures are definitely necessary because we don't want matters to get worse. But how do we escape the pitfall that such a strategy doesn't become a state in which the structures that create injustice in the first place become even more robust and oppressive? Or is that something, as some argue, that is bound in capitalism anyway to happen?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the push is often. I mean, first of all, I'll just say this. In the job that I work, we often talk about IDBEA, which mean and that acronym means inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and belonging. There are various acronyms that companies have to describe the efforts that they do in this area, but diversity is only one aspect, right, of a larger practice that has to happen in corporations to actually make them more supportive or to provide support for people who've often been left out of those conversations or are literally just not been hired by those companies. Diversity, to me, the challenge with it is it's gone through many stages over the history of diversity efforts, and it often just refers to a kind of practice of quotas. So, all right, we need 6 Black people in this job. So let's go and hire 6 Black people. Check. We did it. We're done. And the problems are now over because we have quantified what we need and we've provided what we need. It says nothing about issues of equity, right? Which is not just equality, because we're not even talking about equality. We're just often talking about putting people of color or women or, gay people into particular roles in order to check off these boxes. But equity, I think, is a really important issue, which has to do with the stake that you have in a particular company. It has to do with where you're starting from, because if you're starting from a place of disadvantage, just putting somebody of color, for instance, in a role can highly disadvantage them even more when they're in that role because they don't have the proper support that they need to do the work that they need. So it's not just about putting somebody in a position like that so that you can check off a box and say we did it. It's about actually having that person be supported in such a way that they can help transform the entire corporation or institution so that it will never have to be an institution that excludes people again, ever, right? And to do that, it's very complicated. And very often what happens is people are just doing it for, in a performative way, or it's just about quantification of diversity. We have this many people, but we have to have these conversations about inclusion, about belonging. When you put people of color or women or anybody else who's been marginalized in a position in an institution where people like that have not historically been allowed to participate, how can they thrive? How can they be their most excellent selves in these institutions? And it's a very complicated thing. I've experienced it myself. You have experienced it. I'm sure others have experienced it too. And I do think we need just to get beyond that conversation of the check boxes. That's what I'm most concerned about. But diversity is important in other ways, right? It's about representation. It's about making people feel seen. We do need to have diverse representation, but it can't be the end of the conversation. It's just one part of a larger conversation about inclusion, belonging, equity, ownership, economic justice. Talk to me all day about economic justice, rather than representational justice.
Yeah, at least I could sure listen to you all day, but what I'm getting is that there's definitely needs to be a structure of support to make it more sustainable. What the other question that I have is to mention something a little more inspiring and beautiful from an artistic side, because you brought up Janelle Monae. You also talked about Beyonce. And when I hear those names, I'm thinking recently with Beyonce, but very early on with Janelle Monae. And you also mentioned it about Afrofuturism. What role does Afrofuturism play in world making?
Such a great question. So Afrofuturism, for those who don't know, refers to this kind of the crossroads of Black diasporic cultural practice and science fiction. And so it's a term that was created by the writer Mark Derry and many others have contributed to it as well, people like Greg Tate and others. But it essentially refers to science fiction that's been made by or made for Black people around the world. And part of the reason it's so important is because Afrofuturism, whether we're talking about Uhura on Star Trek, one of the only Black character on that show representing Black women in the 1960s, or whether we're talking about the books of Octavia Butler or Samuel Delany, or whether we're talking about the science fiction films of Antoine Fuqua or others, Afrofuturism is important because it has allowed Black people to imagine themselves beyond the limitations of the present, right? It's been a representational model that has allowed people to think about not only the issues that limit them and the circumstances that limit them in the present, but to imagine it in a different context beyond. And that's the work that science fiction does that I was mentioning in the presentation through Ursula Le Guin, that it allows us to get out of our kind of lazy thinking, and it allows us to speculate about a better future, sometimes based on the existing problems of the present. So Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which is now being made as a movie by Garrett Bradley, I think is an incredibly important book in the context of world making, because it is about this young woman who is facing enormous interlocking, intractable problems. She lives in the future, the near future, in which she's being, her life is literally being threatened by environmental circumstances, wildfire and gun violence and everything else you can possibly imagine, which doesn't sound that different than the existing world that we live in right now. And she has to flee, to escape, to become a kind of fugitive, and to pursue an opportunity for freedom up north. And she creates a community called Earthseed, which becomes her way of imagining a life beyond the life that she lives. And she brings people together as a community under the banner of this notion of Earthseed. And as I mentioned before, Parable of the Sower has been incredibly important to politicians like Stacey Abrams in the United States, who has gone on record as saying Octavia Butler's science fiction and her Afrofuturism has been incredibly important to the way that she thinks about her political strategies. To Janelle Monae, figures like Beyonce as well, who they've engaged in their own Afrofuturistic cultural practices. I think on and on, I think we need to really think about what Black futures look like. And I think one of the ways to do that is to do it through the lens of Afrofuturistic practice. Think about Black Panther, for instance. You know, the second version is opening tomorrow, and think about the ways that has affirmed and inspired people to imagine beyond the very dystopic present that we live in, to imagine another world of possibility through this fiction.
There is so much to talk about, and we're unfortunately out of time. So I, first of all, want to thank you to actually bringing this really, really important issue, and also the theoretical work, and the names of Ruth Wilson Gilmore or Octavia Butler or Ocean Vuong to this stage, because this is incredibly valuable. Thank you so much, Jason King.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Take care.